Thanks, Jen. Welcome everybody to Designing and Implementing High Leverage Instructional Practices, Part 1, Lesson Design Using 3 UDL Principles with Dr. George Bash. I'm Kirsten DeRoche, an educational consultant from the Patton Malvern office. I'll be one of your facilitators this morning. If you need closed captioning, that is available. If you click at the on the button on your Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screen, the transcript should be visible. My colleagues and I will be monitoring the chat for questions or any technical needs. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us if you have any questions or concerns. So once again, please join me in welcoming Dr. George Bash. Dr. George M. Bash is currently Professor and Director Emeritus at the Institute of School Reform and Coordinator of the Graduate Programs in School Psychology at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida. He's the previous co-director of the Florida statewide problem-solving / response to intervention. The Florida statewide, somehow I just lost my bio, sorry.
That's okay.
Currently he's the vice chair of the Professional Advisory Board for the National Center for Learning Disabilities. Dr. Bash was the co-director of the Florida Multi-Tiered System of Supports statewide project with Dr. Don Kincaid of the Florida Positive Behavior Supports Project. The majority of his work has focused on systems of implementing academic, behavior, and social emotional instruction and supports to ensure equity in access for at-risk students. George's experience includes work as a university professor and researcher, a school psychologist, district level administrator, building principal, and consultant to school districts and state agencies regarding the implementation of systemic solutions to improve outcomes for all educators, students, and their families. Dr. Bash is a certified school psychologist, licensed clinical psychologist, and a certified school administrator and director of special education. Sorry for the hiccups. We're glad you're here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. No hiccups. As I was telling everybody, I had a computer failure shortly before this, and we had to switch everything to my wife's computer. So at first, my first name up here was Judy. It was not me, but we worked it all out in about 10 minutes. So we're all used to being flexible, right? In the work that we do every day. I'm really happy to be with you this morning. What we're going to do is just a couple of logistics quickly. As we go through these topics, I'm going to give you time to reflect and discuss at critical points with a focus in that reflection and discussion on basically saying, look, based upon what we've talked about, is this something we're doing? Is this something we can do? And if we are going to do it, what are the resources we have and what are the barriers that we have to remove to do it? And we'll identify some of those resources and barriers as we go along. We're set up to use breakout rooms. I don't know, Kirsten, if you wanted to just quickly make a comment about the breakout rooms.
Sure. So when it's time to go to breakout rooms and talk with your team members, I will go ahead and open them. They're going to be a self-select option. So depending on how long we are, but I'll open them. You will get a button that pops up on your Zoom taskbar. You'll click that. It looks like 4 little boxes and says breakout rooms. And then you'll choose the team space that best matches where you're from and who you're here with. And that's the way that you'll access those. I can remind you all closer to as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kirsten. So let me give you a very brief overview of today in the context of our work throughout this year. Today, we're going to talk about why this integrated lesson planning is so important and the evidence base for how using it improves significantly student outcomes. That's the primary reason for doing this. So we're gonna start off with the compelling why for this, and like I said, we're going to have multiple opportunities to reflect and discuss. I think Jen or Kirsten already mentioned that you have a number of documents in the drive accessible to you. I'm going to be highlighting some of those documents today. Before we get started with this, I want to just put a couple of context to it. We're going to be breaking down this process step by step. And in doing that, it's going to seem like there's a lot that you have to do. The reality is when you do it, all of this stuff is integrated, which you will see over the course of our work together. But breaking it down enables us to ensure that each step of the process has fidelity and integrity and gives you time to say, if we implement this step, or if we are implementing it. Are we implementing it? Are we not? If we're not, what is it going to take to do that? I would like for this to be very organic, very open and honest. We want to talk about what are the resources you have to support this? What are the barriers you have to overcome? Is there time in your schedule? Do people have the background information and the compelling why to understand why this collaboration is important and therefore want to buy into it and own it? So like anything else that we are trying to introduce into a system, there are going to be logistical issues in doing that. Hopefully, everybody is doing some form of lesson planning. So this is not a new concept. And I say hopefully because I'll be very honest with you, I work with a number of places where it's just basically up to individual teachers to do that or not. And so I'm not naive enough to believe that everybody is hitting this on all 6 cylinders. But hopefully there is a baseline for this. We're going to talk about that in a moment, give you time to reflect on it. And so what the real goal of this is, how do we strengthen this process to grab all the impact on student outcomes? That's going to be the perspective. It should already be in people's mindsets, but how do we kind of do it in the 21st century version of this? So with that, I'm going to begin to move along here. The objectives for today, and I'm not going to be reading all of these slides. I got to move some things around on the screen here so I can see my screen. We're going to examine consensus on what practices you're doing right now. We're going to try to get to that compelling why. We want to understand what this framework looks like. We want to know, how do you facilitate it? And how are the principles of UDL integrated into it? It's actually one and the same thing. So we'll really look at that. And then, like I've already said, we want to identify the resources and supports necessary to do it. And the last thing we're going to do today is I have a list based upon our discussion today of suggested implementation activities that you can consider between now and our next session. And we'll review those as we end our day. Also, please, if you have questions, I'm going to be kind of monitoring the chat. I think maybe Kirsten and some of the others here are also going to be monitoring it. So for the patent people who are on here, if you see something come up in the chat and you really think it would be a good point to stop and address it, please interrupt. Okay. It's important that we are responsive to what questions you have at the moment you have them. You have a bunch of materials in that box today. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll highlight some of them as we go through the day. One of the things that I'm going to highlight that we're really going to be focusing on next time, but I want you to read, is we're going to have a lesson design and delivery case study. This is an actual example of a school utilizing this method for a group of students, and we're going to kind of follow that case study as we go. But all of these are available to you in that Google Drive. So before we do this, we have 4 polls, very quick, that we want to do and give you an opportunity to respond. So I'm not sure who's doing the polls, but well, whoever just did it, did it. Awesome. So as soon as we get to the vast majority of people who participated, we'll close it and take a look at the results.
And George, you can see the answers coming in, right?
Correct.
Okay, perfect.
And Kirsten, do you want me to hit the end poll when at that time?
You can, or I can, it doesn't,
Okay.
whatever you'd like.
Well, let's keep it doing one person. Let's have you do it. And then I'll just say, when we get to 75 or 80%, the results aren't going to change much. I don't think they can see the poll yet, right?
They can't see the answers that everybody
Okay.
else has entered yet.
Right. So why don't you go ahead and close it and show everybody the answers. So this is pretty typical. And I'm hoping when we talk about the importance of this on student outcomes, that that will provide some rationale. So what this also tells me as a systems person is we have 42, 56, and 6 is 62% are neutral or strongly disagree. So give or take, if I added those numbers correct, 20 is 62%. So what that means is we have to think about, look, the vast majority of people are not doing this. So we're going to have to think about strategies to get consensus around this, get people to buy into it. And buying into it for me means owning it in a way that you engage in the behaviors of this particular process. So as we go through our reflect and discuss, if 62% don't really have this happening or are neutral about it, in your discussions, please talk about what are some of those barriers to doing it. And we can share those out. Okay, I think I can hit that. And you can go to poll 2. Is that you, Kirsten? Is that who's doing it? Okay. All right, here's poll 2.
Yeah, it's me. Sorry, I was muted.
No, it's okay. No, it's good. Okay, we can close it. Oops, I can end it. You can end it. And if you can show the results, Kirsten. So the distribution is about the same. About the same. So clearly, as we go through the day, and as a result of this, I don't think we're going to have time today because we don't want to cram so much in here that you're overwhelmed by it at first day. So what I will do, definitely for our November session, is I will bring you examples, actual examples from elementary through high school of school schedules that are designed to carve out time and how districts carve out time to do collaborative lesson planning. Okay, we can go to 3, Kirsten. Oh, it's only 1. Sorry, I thought everybody instantly disagreed. It's like, whoa. Okay, that's good. I think we can close it. Well, wait a minute. A little more. It's not getting any. Oh, there's a couple. Let's go ahead and close it, Kirsten, and show the results. All right, this is going to be something we're going to talk about right at the beginning because as you already know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. In a multi-tiered system of supports, except for students who are in general education, 100% with no additional supports, then unless that's the case, then a student has a team of teachers. That team could be two. It could be a special ed teacher and a general ed teacher. It could be a general ed teacher, reading support person, an EL person. The point is they have a team, and individuals on that team are responsible for providing direct instruction. And if that instruction is not collaborative, we'll talk about pacing and those kinds of things, then students are getting instruction in silos, and we're leaving it up to the student to figure out how they're supposed to integrate that to be successful in Tier 1. So in particular, this whole issue and the research around collaborative lesson planning or integrated lesson planning, whatever you want to call it, is really a fairly recent thing in the last 10 years or so, driven by the implementation of MTSS and instruction provided across multiple tiers. And everybody seemed happy to do that, but everybody would go to their own tier and instruct kids. And the result of that was showing not a lot of help for kids. So we'll dig deeper into that, but clearly it's an important need. All right, thanks. Kirsten, and the last poll for right now. Poll 4, there we go. Okay, I think that's good, Kirsten. If you'll share it. So this last poll is a little advanced organizer. There are lots of ways that collaboration can occur across providers. It doesn't have to be face-to-face. If we're using something like Google Docs for lesson plans, then when lesson plans are modified, either the pacing of it, the content, whatever, and that's posted on the lesson plan, then everybody who's in that group will get a ding to say something's changed. So the goal here is that we want to have alignment between Tier 2 and Tier 3 instructional providers and Tier 1, and dissemination and communication can come in different forms. So the reason I had this poll here is I wanted to know the data. But the other is that to emphasize that it's not the way you collaborate and communicate, but it's the fact that you do. And so there's a lot of flexibility in this process. And just as an aside, I have a bunch of grandkids, and for 5 of them in 2 different school districts in 2 different states, the schools, the grade levels post their lesson plans online for parents to know if they want to be helping their kids or what have you, pre-teaching kids or whatever. They have access to lesson plans, which now brings in another potential support system for kids. But it's hard for parents to know if they don't know what is going on. So anyway, okay, that's good for now. Kirsten, thank you. The poll number 5 comes out. I think I'll have it slide 21 as a heads up. Okay, thank you. I'm going to get rid of that, and we're going to move on. So we've already done all the polls. Perfect. So now what I would like to do is I would like for you to, I get rid of that again. I would like to go to breakout rooms This is going to be short. I'm going to ask you to have a discussion about whatever your lesson planning practice looks like. Everything from teachers do it individually, nobody does it, to we have grade level teams, subject area teams, and post some keywords that describe in the total continuum how you see lesson planning in your district. And we can go to breakout and maybe give the warning at 6 minutes, Kirsten, so that at 7 minutes, it will keep us on a good time this morning. But please post some keywords in that chat box for everybody to see.
Okay, breakout rooms have been opened. If you see participants look at your Zoom taskbar across the bottom of your screen, you should see a new button that says breakout rooms. If you open that button, you are able to choose your room based on the school district that you are here with. And I think just to let everybody know, we also added, in case there's any folks here who are not from one of those districts, there's another, and there is also a TAC room if you are here as a TAC. Okay, so I think most people are back or close to being back.
Okay, just let me know when everyone is.
Looks like they're all back.
Okay, awesome. If you want to take a moment to post those keywords in the chat, that'd be nice. Anna Burzens, thanks for modeling that so well. Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, you did it right, Anna. It's perfect. Anybody else want to? Okay. Okay, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I agree, Bianca. Common planning time is needed, and there's a variety of strategies we'll talk about how to get that. But it does require a change. So, you know, that's, yeah, I love your words, Whitney, for your group. Particularly the last one, best intent. Yeah, I think, yeah, Mark, I think that's a good way to describe that. We don't want this to become, we don't want these lesson plans to become a prescription that everybody has to follow. We want them really focusing on content and instructional practices, and that can be pretty broad. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for posting in the chat for those of you who have, and if you want to post some more, that'd be great as well. So I want to talk about the why of this, because we don't want to do something that's just a popular practice or even a best practice unless we have some evidence for it. So I want to very quickly go through a couple of things here that I want you to think about and potentially use back at the ranch if you are going to move forward with trying to implement some of this. So when we take a look at priorities for maximizing rate of student growth, we don't want to look just at instruction. We'll talk about that in a moment. Leadership contributes to student outcomes, and we have the numbers to tell you exactly. Collaboration contributes to student outcomes. We have the numbers. Sufficient time. In order to collaborate, people have to have the time to do that. And then effective instruction, which we're really going to be focusing on in November. delivered in sufficient amounts. Highly effective instruction can be delivered in somewhat of a less time than less effective instruction. But we will talk about that as we move through this. So let's just review just remind ourselves what the components of MTSS are, the 6 components of it. Every state is a little bit different, but these components are central to every state's framework. The wording may be a little bit different. The point that I want here to mention here is that these 6 components, one of them is multiple tiers of instruction. The other 5 have the responsibility by their actions to increasing the impact of instruction on student outcomes. So how much does leadership contribute to improving the impact of instruction? We'll talk about in a moment. Capacity building, the infrastructure, schedules, professional learning, communication and collaboration. It's only been once again in the last maybe decade that we have some good research on collaboration. In a moment, we're going to talk about what collaborative activities improve student outcomes and which ones do not. If we're going to be doing use of data, we have to have evidence that that contributes to multiple tiers of instruction. And we have to have a process of problem solving when we have run out of good evidence-based ideas. We're going to be talking about data aligned with this model, I think beginning in session 3, maybe. So we'll bring that in. But for today, we're going to focus on leadership and collaboration. So we're going to take a look at leadership first. And I have this little graphic here because it defines leadership in the type of leadership that is evidence-based to improve student outcomes. So the function of leaders is to influence and support. There's not a lot of evidence, for example, that building principals who focus on trying to improve teacher instructional practices, if that is effective in producing student outcomes. And we'll talk about why in a second. So here's some information for you. Leadership used to explain about 25% of what predicted student outcomes. But recent research, and I will, in a moment, I have the reference for the Wallace Foundation report from 2021, has bumped that up to about 30%. So the kind of leadership in a building can influence up to 30% of what predicts student outcomes. Classroom factors on instruction is responsible for about 33% of what predicts student outcomes. So between those 2 factors, we have about 60% of what predicts student outcomes under our control. There's a lot of things we can't control. We can't control student mobility. We can't control issues of poverty. We can't control issues of mental health issues and social emotional issues in a family. But we can control how the climate of our buildings, and we can control the impact of the instruction on student outcomes, and we're over 60%. Collaboration will improve that a little further. So well, I keep hitting the wrong button, sorry. So a couple of examples. Collective, there's a lot of kinds of leadership models. Collective leadership, defined at the bottom as teachers and administrators and teacher leaders leading together, recognizing long-term success rests on diverse perspectives and contributions. It's interesting that if you read this report, that principals felt, or many feel that unless the leadership is hierarchical, teachers won't respect the principal. But when teachers were research on teachers' perspective about this was very clear that teachers have far greater respect for principals and supervisors, grade level leaders, who share this leadership in a collective way. So we'll talk more about that. I want you to read this, just read this. I guess it's a paragraph. Read this paragraph. So we still kind of have a culture in schools where we're on that search for the holy grail of interventions. What's the best intervention to do? This is very sobering data right here. Building principals who exercise collective leadership, create a climate in the school through collaboration and the impact of collaboration on student outcomes, that replacing a below average principal with an above average one, the effects of that on student outcomes is greater than 70% of the effects of interventions in 747 studies. So the bottom line here is that we can't put all of our pressure on teachers. We have to understand what else controls student outcomes and predicts student outcomes, and have courageous conversations about that. So leadership, collective leadership, it is clearly the type of leadership that'll get you that 30%. And to be honest with you, I work with lots of school districts in Pennsylvania as well as other states. And the idea that a building principal, when assigned to a building, can simply have the kind of leadership she or he wants makes it very entrepreneurial, when the research tells us in education what kind of leadership has the greatest impact on student outcomes. So I wonder why school districts don't ensure that collective leadership is occurring in each building. Oh, and by the way, the reason that the impact on math is greater is because, for the most part, students get the vast majority of their instruction in math in school, where literacy, they're exposed to reading and literacy more broadly outside of school on a regular basis, not so much math. So let's take a look now at collaboration and communication. You can see here that schools with higher levels, and this is really important to read this carefully, schools with higher levels of collaboration also had higher levels of student achievement, even after controlling for student variables, gender, race, socioeconomic status, and prior achievement, school level, school size, school-wide proportion, student demographics. So collaboration, as we're going to focus it on integrated lesson planning, school-wide significantly impacts student outcomes. The other thing that is important, I don't know that I have it. I don't think I've included it here because I'm trying to, didn't want to, we only have 3.5 hours together today, or less, actually. Let me see that. Yeah, so there's another slide that I normally have in here that basically says individual teacher-to-teacher collaboration has no evidence in improving student outcomes school-wide. So this collaboration has to be a school-wide process in order to get the impact on student outcomes. And there are only two kinds of collaboration that the research has said promotes gains in student learning. One is collaboration around using data to develop instructional responses. And the second one is collaboration focused on instructional curriculum and instructional decision-making and planning. So if we take a look at what we have our teaming folks doing, the research is very clear. There's only evidence that teaming around use of data for instructional decision-making and collaborative lesson planning are the two that the two types of collaboration that are evidence-based for improving student outcomes. So collaboration within a school cannot exist and thrive without collective leadership. So they're very much related to one another. So Kirsten, if you can put poll 5 up, that would be helpful. Okay, thanks, Kirsten. If you can show the results. So you can see here that roughly 74%, 75% of you are either neutral or disagreeing with this statement. So I think that one of the things that, make a note to self, that sharing this information about the relationship, what collaboration focuses on data-based decision making, only if we use data to influence instructional decisions, and this collaborative lesson planning. Those are the only two teaming kinds of things that are currently evidence-based to improve student outcomes. So food for thought, maybe fodder for discussions. Okay, thank you, Kirsten. Does everybody see those? Okay, perfect. So I'd like for you to, I'm going to give you another 7 minutes if we can do that, Kirsten. I would like for you to reflect and discuss this, how you might introduce this concept of integrated lesson planning using the information we shared today, and how would you, provide that compelling why. Remember that Joyce and Showers, who are the two significant researchers in professional learning in education, said that teachers will embrace things if two conditions exist. One is if they see the need for it. And teachers, almost the majority of the time, teachers will identify that need is it good for my students? And then the second element is if they understand the need for it and want to do it, then you have to ask, do they have the skills to do it? Or can we get them the skills to do it? So teachers will say, we're happy to do this if there's a compelling need and if we have the supports to do it. That supports could be professional learning. It could be simply time in the schedule. It could be a variety of supports, but understanding the need and ensuring they have the supports to do it. So let's take 7 minutes to discuss this stuff about the compelling why and how you might be able to leverage it in your district moving forward. So Kirsten.
Okay, so I can go ahead and open those rooms. What I noticed though is that there are a lot of folks who joined the TAC room, so there must be a lot of TAC here, and there were a lot of people in the other room and not so many within the teams. So I just wanted to say too, if you're here as just a single person from your school, or if you're in one of those larger groups and you want to join one of the other rooms and with some other people, feel free to join any of those others where you don't see folks. So I'm going to go ahead.
That's a great suggestion, Kirsten. Because you don't have to be, if you're by yourself, please join a group that's a school or district team.
And if anybody's having problems with in
Perfect. Welcome back, everyone. If you would, as we move on to the next, if somebody in your group or yourself would just post, a few things in the chat box that that kind of characterize your discussion about this, using this information as a launching pad to beginning to attain consensus on this collaborative lesson planning plan. I appreciate it. Okay, so a couple of things very quickly. As you know, in a multi-tiered system of supports, the tiers don't exist. What they do reflect is intensification of instruction. One of the things that we know is that, if core instruction is not particularly good or is not particularly good for the students that you're concerned about, interventions basically cannot make up for those issues in core instruction. So the first thing we always need when we're doing lesson planning is understanding how we intensify instruction. I know, Anna, you had something in there about using curriculum and I think IEP deficits and what have you. So clearly for some of your students with disabilities, we have to integrate this intensified instruction along with the tier 1 instruction. So I'm going to be very concrete with you. Intensity is defined by 3 variables: how much time we spend with the student or students, and I'll quit saying student or students. So how much time we have with the students, what the focus of the work is going to be, and what the particular type of instruction is going to be. In general, when we move up the tiers, tier 2, tier 3, there's more time, a narrower focus, and perhaps a different type of instruction. This has to be common language, common understanding. So if you asked any teacher in your building where you're doing MTSS, what's the difference between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3? The correct answer is the intensity of the instruction. And that for kids who need more intense instruction, that means more time. We narrow the focus of that time to the areas where the kid is struggling with, and we are very flexible on the type of instruction we use to get the kid over those barriers. I also just want to emphasize, and always do this, that when we're looking at multi-tiered system of supports, we're not just looking at low-performing students. High-performing students also need a multi-tiered system of supports. And I think that, some of the greatest pressures on kids are in IB programs in high school or advanced placement classes. There's a lot of social emotional pressure there. Plus, even in your highest performing in an IB school, you're going to have kids at multiple levels of performance. And kids are going to struggle with the content. And what kind of supports are you going to provide to those kids? Not only instruction, but also behavior and social emotional. So we want to think about all kids here. And please remember that specially designed instruction, which is the requirement for eligibility for special education. The difference between 504 and special ed is very simple. Both kids have disabilities, but only one requires specially designed instruction as opposed to accommodations. That specially designed instruction plus a disability is what is necessary for eligibility for special education. And in this US Department of Education graphic, specially designed instruction occurs at all tiers for kids with disabilities. And when we come to our case study and looking at that, we're going to be very practical in terms of what this looks like. So instructional challenges within MTSS. How do we ensure that the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction is consistent across the tiers? And is there understanding and consensus that scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction for all students is determined by the scope, sequence, and pacing of tier 1? How do we ensure that all instruction is aligned with the greater subject level standards? That was a question that I asked Anna earlier in the chat box. Is the instructional planning aligned with either common learning goals or grade level or subject area standards. This is a biggie for kids with disabilities and for kids who are English learners, for sure. And last, how do we ensure that all instruction increases student access to grade level content for the grade in which the student is enrolled? Now, you know, lots of things come and go in education, and we miss a lot of stuff and what have you, but it has now been, in November, it'll be 7 years since the US Office of Education sent out a memo to all school district superintendents through NASD, the special education group, that students with disabilities, the IEP goals have to be goals that are aligned with the standards for the grade level in which the student is enrolled, not their performance level. And I don't know if many of you can put this in a chat box if you wish, just affirm it or not. If you're using electronic IEPs, most of those electronic IEP programs will not allow you to pick goals that are below the grade level for which the kid is enrolled. So that becomes a real challenge, right? And it requires all the resources and all the integrated lesson planning to ensure that we do that. So 3 takeaways here. Scope, sequence, and pacing of all instruction is aligned with the scope, sequence, and pacing of Tier 1. How do we ensure that all the instruction, regardless of the tier, is aligned with those grade level standards? And how do we ensure that that scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction is consistent across instructional providers? That these challenges within MTSS framework are resolved if we're doing collaborative lesson planning. So I'm going to ask you this question broadly defined. I'm going to give you a couple of examples because we don't, you guys know what MTSS is. One of the foundations for doing this work is that we have a clear understanding of what the characteristics of instruction are across the tiers. What is instruction? What are the characteristics of Tier 1 instruction? What are the characteristics of Tier 2? What are the characteristics of Tier 3? And this is important because how can we do lesson planning across tiers of instruction and providers if we don't even know what instruction looks like in tiers that we're not responsible for, right? So this is I'm not going to go through this in great intensity, but this is an example of what we're talking about. So for each of the tiers in your district, do you have a description of the time, the focus, and the type of instruction? And you can add assessments to that. So in the case of Tier 1, it is the fewest minutes of instruction. ELA, elementary ELA, 90 minutes. Algebra at the high school, it depends on how you block, 50, 60, some places 100. The focus, it's the broadest focus. Take literacy. All the 5 components of literacy, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, they're all taught in Tier 1. And the type of instruction should be universal, which hopefully is a term that by the end of our time together, you will embrace. And that means instruction, instructional strategies that are evidence-based for diverse learners simultaneously. And in November, we will take a look at those examples of what universal instruction looks like compared to what we might call just general ed instruction. So it's the shortest amount of time, the broadest content, and instruction that has to reach all students. This is some example of characteristics of Tier 2, and I'm just giving you examples of them in case you don't have stuff in your district. The time is up to 50% more than core. Up to. So therefore, we have to have schedules that permit that. We will look at some schedules in November. The focus is going to be narrower. It's going to be strategic to the areas of greatest need. So take literacy. It may just focus on fluency. It may just focus on comprehension. And the type of instruction, there's two things in tier 2. One is, look, some kids just need more time. They don't need specialized instruction. They need 2, 3, 4 exposures to content, and they'll get it. Sometimes students need strategic instruction like pre-teach, explicit, guided, corrected. So when we look at what we offer in tier 2, and I'll go to the next one. This is what some students get. So we're looking at small group instruction. We're looking at a standard protocol approach. What does that mean? That means that we problem solve the problem that these students have. We organize students by common problem. And we utilize instructional strategies that are evidence-based for the problem. We focus on the essential skills. One of the things as a building principal that I did every year was to provide time at the end of the year and a smaller amount of time at the beginning of the year for grade level teams to meet with each other. So like the 5th grade team and the 6th grade team met. And the question for every one of these team combinations was, the 5th grade teachers have to understand what the 6th grade teachers consider to be the essential skills they want students coming to the 6th grade with. What are the most important skills for 5th graders to bring to the 6th grade? So the standard protocol approach might be simply pre-teaching additional time. So for some kids, they don't need specialized instruction. They just need more time and have it done, have it taught to them. Pre-teaching is better than reteaching. For others, it may be, we want to create win groups, what I need. And we are going to select particular instructional practices for the focus of the area around which the win groups have been organized. So we want to say, what does tier 2 look like? That general education teacher needs to know whether we're doing a double scoop, either in the gen ed classroom or elsewhere. We're simply getting more time for exposure to that instruction, or we're going to organize kids by common need, select instructional practices that are evidence-based for that need, and then provide them up to 50% more time, up to. I have worked with a lot of places say, well, our RTI time is 30 minutes a day. That'll work great for the kids who need 30 minutes, but what about for the kids who need 40 minutes, 45 minutes? Tier 3 is the most intensive. Most schools don't have the resources to provide tier 3 instruction to more than 5-6% of the students in the building. These are very small groups. And remember, for tier 3, we don't want to do individual instruction except in rare occasions. Kids learn better in very small groups faster than if it is one-to-one instruction. So we might have to have up to 50% more time. So we have schools here in Florida that are 80% Hispanic, non-English speaking. There's no way that these students can be taught to read in English in the 90 minutes, and there's no way they can be taught in 130 minutes. So in the schedule, and we'll look at this next time, these kids are getting exposed to 180 minutes a day of literacy. So that is a tier 1 thing because the school is that way. So what are the characteristics of tier 3 instruction when it is done in this small group? So I have another example here. More instructional time, smaller groups, more precisely targeted at the student need, and clearer and more detailed explanations, and more systematic instructional sequences, more extensive opportunities for guided practice, more opportunities for error correction and feedback. So the resources that you need are time and the groups. The skill focus is around targeting, explanation, sequences, guided practice, and error correction and feedback. So that describes what happens in tier 3. And whatever description you're going to have for your district. So understanding this process within a multi-tiered system of supports in terms of what products could we have in our district that meet this goal. We could have a characteristics of instruction rubric. We could have multi-supports resource map. And we could have a resource map showing how we integrate academic behavior and social emotional. So I've given you a template that is an example of a characteristics of instruction across the tiers. There's 3 pages to this: tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And I've also given you an example of a completed one for tier 1. This is focused on literacy. And this school broke it down into K2, 3, 5. So, they're using Wilson's Foundations, 15 to 20 minutes, 5 days a week, focused on vocabulary development, handwriting fluency. The type of instruction is structured, multisensory, corrective, and the group size is whole group or small group, depending upon the classroom. Now, if your tier 2 and tier 3 special ed, EL folks clearly understood what's going on in tier 1, that's going to help them do their lesson planning for supporting what is happening in tier 1. So you have these 2 resources. As we go through our time together, I'll give you some other examples of this. And they will always be examples of ones that are completed by schools. So now I'm going to ask you very quickly I'm going to do 5 minutes on this discussion. In your school or district, do guidelines or deliverables exist so that there's a common language, common understanding of the characteristics of instruction for each of the tiers? Does everybody understand what happens in tier 2, what happens in tier 3, what happens in tier 1? And what are the facilitators that exist that can promote an understanding, and what are the barriers that have to be reduced before you can get a product like this, so that everybody understands what instruction looks like across the tiers? That's going to be very important, because you can't do lesson planning in a multi-tiered system unless everybody understands what instruction looks like in those tiers. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about how you can facilitate this understanding of the tiers. That might be a rubric developed by at the school, or barriers that exist doing that, and how might you reduce them. Thanks. Okay, thanks, folks. I'm looking at the chat box. Kevin, yeah, how do I find time to effectively collaborate? We're definitely going to address those with a variety of ways to look at it. Our district is approaching a more collaborative, collective approach. Others are sharing that time is the major variable. Absolutely. Anna, thank you again for your comment. I don't know you, but I really respect your honesty and you're willing to communicate. So thanks. And you talk about UDL has been so much fun to implement. So the question I wanted to address is the issue of IEPs, goals being grade level for the grade level the student is enrolled in versus instructional level. At the lower elementary level, K through 3, there's really not a huge issue with this, simply because K3 or pre-K3 is learning to read. Beginning at 4th grade and on all the way through 12th, it's reading to learn. So I'm really talking about kids at 3rd grade level on up. And here's the dilemma. First of all, fact. Students with disabilities compared to all other student groups are the lowest performing in the United States. So that is one of the reasons why we are just fanatic about looking at ways to improve outcomes. But part of the reason for that is that students with disabilities take the same state assessments as students without disabilities. And there's a couple of reasons, probably 3 reasons that I can think of that why kids don't do well on state assessments. One is that they struggle with the skills to do what the state assessment is showing. Another one would be that the students haven't been taught what is being assessed. And that's the big issue for students with disabilities. So when we take a look at anchor standards beyond the 3rd grade, there are no standards that include fluency. The standards are all comprehension related. And you know from the anchor charts for K through 12 that words in the kindergarten anchor chart for reading comprehension appear in the 12th grade description of reading comprehension. So here's the dilemma, and the case study that we're going to be working on is going to address exactly this, Anna, but I wanted to recognize your comment and your concern. So I'm going to frustrate you a little bit by leaving you with this dilemma. So we have a 6th grade student reading at the 2nd grade level, fluency-wise. We know that kids don't write effectively above their fluency level. But we have a kid being exposed to 6th grade materials who doesn't have the fluency skills to access the content in those materials. So our IEP is going to look very different. We're going to have a 6th grade comprehension goal, but we're going to have the use of technology, for example, to allow that kid to access the content. That could be text to speech, speech to text. It could be a whole variety of ways, because I tell you, and you know this, is that just because a kid can't read a word doesn't mean the kid doesn't understand the meaning of that word if somebody says it to him or her. So what we have to do is to provide supports in tier 1 to ensure that this kid has access to the content and that the disability isn't limiting access to the content. At the same time, the special educator is going to focus on trying to increase that fluency, but also teach the student how to effectively use the technology in order to access the content. That's just kind of an overall view of this. And just as an aside, I seldom, because I do a lot of work reviewing stuff for districts and whatever, I seldom see goals in an IEP that target teaching a student how to use the technology in order to be successful, let's say in a gen ed classroom. We'll just say, goes and uses a computer for this or that. As you know, reading a book with a book in front of you opened and reading a book on Kindle are 2 different things. So anytime we have use of technology, we got to have a goal saying how the kid has been trained in that technology. So I hope that gives a general answer, but our case study is going to address that in a very detailed way. I hope that's enough for now, Anna, because you asked the $10,000 question here, but we can do it. We absolutely can do it, but we only can do it through collaborative lesson planning. So, okay. And I'll keep watching the chat box, and you guys monitor that too for me, or I might miss something. All right, so very quickly. Effective instruction, we're going to take a break here in about 5 minutes. Effective instruction has 3 critical elements: the planning for it, the use of evidence-based approaches to instruction, and the use of appropriate data to evaluate the impact of that instruction on student outcomes. And in the case of Anna's question here, we have to have a wider scope of assessments for English learners and students with disabilities, because one of data collection is typically not going to give us a picture of what the student has learned. We'll talk more about that when we get into session 3. This, right now, we're looking at the process of how do we plan together so that the student gets high impact instruction. So here, Kirsten, here's another one. Kirsten asked me how I got these really cool backgrounds. And I told her, when you do PowerPoints, if you're hooked to the internet, up in the top right-hand corner, there's this thing called Design Ideas. And it includes videos, it includes cool stuff. And I have no creativity. I'm the antithesis of creative. So I rely on this little service. So let's remember, curriculum is what we teach. Instruction is how we teach it. We don't have much control at a school level over curriculum. That's driven by standards, etc. But we do have power to determine what instructional approaches are we going to use to teach the curriculum. And that's important. Now, an aside for you district folks, I'm working with a large district in a state close to you, about 35,000 students. And I challenged them as part of implementing the MTSS process. I'm like, does your Office of Curriculum and Instruction, is that just a label? Is it really an Office of Curriculum? Or does that office also have the responsibility for identifying evidence-based instructional strategies or approaches for the kinds of students you have in your district to access that curriculum? And I almost never find that an Office of Curriculum and Instruction also posts, here are the evidence-based instructional strategies for kids, for diverse learners. That's often left up to the school. Well, the school doesn't have any time for that. And if you're doing individual lesson planning, if that teacher doesn't have access to what is evidence-based for the particular skill and the particular demographics of the student, then that's not going to be found either. There's a greater chance that it can be found if we're doing collaborative. But I'm going to put some expectations on districts here. You know, just don't shove out information about curriculum. Somebody has got to provide information about what evidence-based instructional strategies exist. And we are going to get into that in November. So in a standards aligned instruction model, you know, you should have, this is one we have here in Florida. You should have some graphic to describe how this lesson planning process happens. So you have some kind of standard or benchmark, and from that you develop learning goals. The learning goals then are activated by lesson planning and monitored by assessment. So the first question is, does everybody in your district kind of understand what this process is of moving from standards or benchmarks to student outcomes? Food for thought. So the flow of integrated lesson planning, this is the framework for it. It has 4 steps. Now this framework, we're going to drill this down. I don't know how far we'll get today, but when we come back from our break, we are going to look at this framework. The framework is more important. Understanding the critical elements of the framework is most important at this level, because you have flexibility on how to do each of these steps. I'm going to give you protocols and what have you to look at it, but we're going to come back and talk about these 4 steps to this process and what that looks like for the rest of our time today. So I have about 2 minutes after 10 o'clock. Can we come back? Let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 17 minutes after 10 o'clock. So Kirsten, will you monitor that for us? Thank you, everyone. Take a break.
Yes, Dr. Bash, I think so.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back. We had some conversations, and we're going to drill down deeper next time around the whole example of IEPs, grade level, and what that looks like in planning. So, as I said right before the break, we want to have a good understanding of the components of the framework, which define the collaboration activities to result in consistent instruction across providers and tiers. So these are pretty straightforward. Step one, all teachers involved in instruction for a grade or subject area attend an integrated lesson planning meeting. That would mean gen ed, special ed, reading support, etc. So clearly, one of the issues we have to deal with is the logistics of how does that happen. In most schools doing this planning is done either for a 2 or 4 week period of time. If it's done for a 4 week period of time, it's a little more global than down in the weeds with page numbers and what have you. But if you have put these on Google Docs and everybody has access to it, then as those gen ed teachers get to that 3rd week, the week ahead of time, they're going to be putting down exact information about pacing, page numbers, or what have you. But we want all teachers to be able, the ideal here is a face-to-face with all of the people at the same table. That meeting, it's interesting. That meeting is supposed to be that gen ed group, let's say grade level or subject area, talking about what the learning goals, the content, and what instructional approaches they're going to be using. While the tier 2, tier 3 special ed are listening to that, right? But it rarely turns out that way. It almost always turns out in terms of the gen ed teacher saying, here are the learning goals, here are the instructional approaches that we're going to be using. But we're worried that these instructional approaches are not going to work for these 5, 6, or 7 students, or 10 students, or it depends upon how many you have at a grade level or at a secondary level. And they turn to the reading support, special ed, EL, whoever else is there to say, what do you recommend that we do? We're going to, and some of the stuff that Anna is doing and mentioned she's doing with UDL, working through the principles of UDL is the answer to that. So these are not separate steps. The first one is we got to find out what the scope, sequence, and pacing and the focus is for gen ed instruction. Everybody has to know that, because that is going to determine at the end of the year collectively what is going to be assessed and aligning that content with what is going to be assessed. The second step is I'm going to call it specialized instruction folks. Plan to talk about what they're going to do, whether that's an IEPs, reading support, EL work, what they're going to do now that they know what general ed is going to do. Step 3 is, and if you have Google Docs, this is an easy way to do it. Step 3 is the specialized instructional people communicating what they're going to be doing to the general ed teachers. So that way the general ed teachers can understand how the supports provided by the other people align with the work that they're doing. So, for example, we know that pre-teaching is a far more effective strategy than reteaching, primarily because if we reteach, we have to undo um, inappropriate learning, and then teach what we wanted them to know and be able to do. If you pre-teach, whether you're special ed, reading support, EL, what doesn't matter. If you do pre-teaching on the pacing chart with whatever you're doing, and I mentioned to Anna at the break, if we're working on fluency and we want to really be consistent, particularly for kids up to the middle school age, who are still at concrete level of operations cognitively, they can't abstract. It's very hard for them to take something in one setting that doesn't look like what's happening in general ed and make that transition. So if we use common materials in our specialized work, and if we have a 6th grade kid reading at the 2nd grade level, that 6th grade material, whether it's social studies or literacy, it has tons of words in it that are at the 2nd grade level. And we can pick those words to be the focus of our instructional approaches. And that way the kid is getting exposure to the content at grade level while the student is getting specialized instruction, whether that's an EL, reading support, or special ed. But we need to let the gen ed teachers know what we're doing so they can see how tier 2 and tier 3 and specially designed is a support system to general ed. And then step 4, and I can't remember if I had. No, I don't think I have. Doesn't matter. Step 4 is having specialized instructional personnel going and observing in tier 1 to see what it is their students are being exposed to, what they're expected to know, and whether or not what you're doing is resulting in them being more proficient and successful in tier 1. As a building principal, and if necessary, I would go in and cover a class for 20 minutes or 25 minutes. We had other people who also did that, school psychologists, speech therapists. There were a whole bunch of internal, non-general ed teaching people who were available to provide some classroom support for out of classroom work for gen ed teachers. We had multiple opportunities throughout the year for our specialized teaching staff to observe general ed and for general ed to come and observe specialized teaching. So those 4 components, clearly understanding what's going on in general ed, aligning specialized supports with that scope, sequence, pacing, lesson plans, communicating what the specialized folks are doing, and then this observation process. Now, that's usually more intensive the first year that you do this, but if you do it, that learning by general ed teachers about what does specially designed instruction look like? And I can't tell you how many times gen ed teachers said, I can do that. Instead of trying to differentiate for this kid, I do exactly what Anna is doing when this kid gets a bump in the road. I just didn't know that till I saw what she was doing. So the benefits of this are just tremendous. And what it results in is kids getting an integrated instructional process. So what we're going to do for the rest of our time today is to go through as many of these steps as possible. And I have given you some materials. So the other thing I just wanted to mention is when we're thinking about lesson planning, we have to think about the 4 elements that come together in teaching learning. That is instruction, curriculum, the environment in the classroom, and the learner characteristics themselves. We're going to be talking about the environment. That environment is really for instruction. It's principle 3 of UDL. So just a little framework for when we come back. You also have, and tier 1 basically focuses its work around instruction, curriculum, and the environment. And tier 2 and 3 will bring in the particular learner. You remember when I said tier 3 was we group kids together by having a common need. We use a standard protocol approach, evidence-based instructional strategies for that particular skill need. We don't really get too deep into diagnostic kind of things until tier 3, because we get about a 70% success rate if we organize kids by common need and use evidence-based practices for what that common need is. So this is just a little rubric defining what you already know. We've gone over that. Let's just do something here real quick. I'm going to back up. Instruction is how we teach. Curriculum is what we teach. Environment is about where instruction takes place, and the learner is learner characteristics. So with that in mind, just look at this first one. If I can move your faces out of the way here. Sorry. The schedule does not provide time or opportunity for practice and instruction necessary to catch up. If we think that isn't what may be going on here, is that instruction, curriculum, environment, or the learner? What do you think? Put it in the chat box real quick. Put I, C, E, or L. Yep, awesome. E. So if we don't have enough time, extra time to give students support, you can never find an instructional approach that is going to catch a student up when that student is having the same amount of time of instruction as students without issues. So when we come back in November, I'm going to talk to you about a decision tree that is called time, what, who, and where. We don't worry about the what until we identify how much time we have for the what. And we don't worry about the who until we've decided what the instruction has to look like, and then be sure that the who knows how to deliver that kind of instruction. So we're going to talk about some of those common sense things. Instructional strategies do not emphasize explicit instruction, content enhancement routines, sufficient feedback, guided instruction, or differentiation. What do you think that is? I, C, E, or L? Sure. Expectations at home and school community for performance are low. These are kids with disabilities. We just want them to improve. We don't expect them to ever achieve grade level performance. What is that? This might be a little different. I would call it E for environment. If the home, school, and community don't have high expectations for students, then that environment is going to result in students not attaining that. And I goofed up and gave you the last one. The pacing is too fast, doesn't provide for sufficient student engagement. That's curriculum. Yeah, perfect. So this is just a little exercise to remind us that as we're lesson planning, we have to think of all of these components at once. And it may be for some of our students that building principal, maybe the district, we've got to change the schedule to get the time we need before we even start deciding what we're going to do with that time. So, quick review of the 3 principles of UDL, and then we're going to start integrating this. Principle 1, providing multiple means of multiple instructional approaches in methods. Not every student responds to the same method, right? Principle 2, providing multiple means for kids to demonstrate what they have learned. Once again, we said if you're fluent at second grade level, that's going to be your writing level too. So trying to measure comprehension for a sixth grade student in a written format makes no sense. All you'll do is to be looking at what the student can't read fluently. And principle 3 is multiple means of engagement. How do we organize, deliver, select in a way that will engage the students sitting in front of us? Next time, we're going to talk about some behavior supports integrated with instruction. But for example, student choice. Students have choices about either which stories to read or how to demonstrate what they know. Anytime you give students choice, it increases engagement. So those are the 3 principles of UDL. But for me, and this is my bias, for me, if you take a look at the words universal design for learning, the 3 principles were created to guide lesson planning. Outside the context of lesson planning, I don't know what UDL means. I have no clue because it's out of context. So just some quick examples, and we're going to come back to this. We don't have to go through all of this. Here's some examples of, I have to keep moving your faces around, of general strategies of multiple presentation styles. The parallel for those for specially designed instruction. So when we're thinking about all the students in our, well, we'll get to that. I don't want to jump the gun here. This is from the Florida Center for Reading Research. It's the 10 most evidence-based and powerful strategies for teaching literacy. So this would be another way we could look at different ways of representation. Principle 2 is different ways that students can express what they know. And there could be others here. One of the challenges we have, but we have solutions, and we're going to go over this either next time or the multiple of these or the third session, is if we give huge flexibility in student performance for demonstrating knowledge and skills, how do we assess it? Because otherwise you say, well, that's watering down. It's not fair that they get to do it verbally and other kids have to write it or whatever. Well, the answer to that is if you have scoring rubrics that are independent of how the kid got access to the curriculum and independent of what manner the kid demonstrates what they know, then you can use rubrics which level the playing field for fairness and difficulty level by whether somebody drew a picture, did a newscast, verbally responds, writes the answer. These scoring criteria are the same. So we can have a young kid, draw a picture of what she or he heard. And if that teacher knew that there were 3 critical things that you wanted the student to know from being exposed to that paragraph or whatever, and those 3 critical things were in the picture, that's just as good as a student saying it or a student writing it down. But these scoring rubrics were developed because the standards don't say how kids are supposed to access the content or demonstrate it. So we'll dive into this deeper, but there are methods that once you get very flexible in allowing students to perform differently, you have assessment approaches that are common across all students, which stops the that's not fair, that's watering it down issue. So I just want to, sorry about that, this reflect and discuss. So principle 3 is basically looking at what is it about the classroom structure? What is it about the climate, culturally responsive practices? What is it about classroom social emotional learning and behavior supports integrated into instruction, which we'll talk about November 9th. These are the things that ensure that that environment is safe for students to risk. That environment takes into consideration the culture of students. The structure of the classroom is sufficient to maximize student performance. And we're going to look at some of those structural elements. I don't think I included them here. I didn't. Structural elements in November. So principle one is, do we have methods of ensuring that we can select multiple instructional strategies based on the needs of kids? Principle two is, do we have flexible ways that students can demonstrate what they know and a grading or an evaluation system that ensures that we maintain the integrity of what we expect of students, regardless of how they demonstrate it. And then the third one is that lesson built in an environment and using context to engage students in it? So I do want you to talk about this. I'm going to give you 7 minutes for this one. I would like for you to answer, do you have a common language, common understanding about how of UDL, but specifically to guide lesson planning? And what are some things you might have to do to strengthen that understanding? So 7 minutes, Kirsten, if we can put those rooms in action.
Rooms are open. Yep.
Yeah, cabin fever is the worst to deal with in your kids. That's one of the few times I would let mine do whatever it is they wanted to do, just if they would quit griping. Yeah, well, a 1-year-old, good luck there. So if you will, somebody on your team, just put a few words in the chat box, kind of describing your conversation about this, please. And then we'll all look and what have you as we go along. Okay, one of the things I want that is extremely important to remember, and the research now is getting pretty good at showing this, high quality academic instruction, content matched to student success, frequent opportunity to respond, frequent feedback, by itself can reduce problem behavior. So I just wanted to show you this study that just came out about 1.5 years ago that demonstrated that one of the strongest protective factors for social emotional wellness is effective instruction. It is a behavioral strategy and a mental health strategy. And this is not in here, but just remember, and if you can look, I'll give you a visual, moving visual here. Anytime that the demand of a task for kids or adults, but in this case we're talking about kids, maybe, is significantly higher than the skill level of a student, that difference will always generate a behavioral and or a social emotional response. Always. So when we have our students with disabilities or English learners or any student, but in particular those because they're more at risk, in an environment where they cannot engage the instruction, that is going to result in us, we better have a good plan for what are we going to do about the behavioral or social emotional response to that. The other thing to remember is that most students, younger ones quicker than older ones, will decide anywhere within the first couple of minutes to the first 5 or 10 minutes of a lesson whether they can engage it or not. If they can't, they disengage, either outward or inward. So as teachers, we have to think, I've got, for 3rd grade kids, I've got 3 minutes to engage them. Whatever I do first with them in my planning has got to be powerful and engaging, because I've only got 3 or 4 minutes to grab them. So there's that initial, how do I engage the students? That becomes part of this planning process. So just as an aside. So how are we going to integrate UDL and lesson planning? Well, by now it should be, hopefully it'll be somewhat obvious. So here's our framework again, right? This is a case study. I'm giving you this case study for two reasons. One is you may wish as teams to use this case study to apply some of the strategies that we're talking about. The other thing is, as we go along, I am going to scaffold this case study by what actually happened and how planning actually occurred. So between now and next time, this is in your Google file. Between now and next time, if you will thoroughly review this case study, I picked a 6th grade example that I had because it kind of bridges elementary and secondary. Like you'll see standard there, 6 RN 2.2. That's just the states naming their standard, that's all. But please read that, and we're going to keep coming back to it, and applying these strategies. So let's take a look at how academic behavior and social emotional is involved in each thing we plan and ask kids to do. Academic skills are required to succeed at the task. Academic behaviors are necessary to engage the task. So you have some kids, maybe a kid with ADHD, and the kid has the skills to succeed, but the kid doesn't know how to start the task. So the teacher has to come and get them started on the task. And the intrapersonal and social emotional learning skills to manage the task. So you have kids that have the skill, they have to engage it, and they simply don't have the will to do it. So when we're planning, we have to think about all 3 of these things. How are we going to ask kids to engage it? How are we going to ask kids to manage it? I mean, you hear teachers, just because teachers are so good at what they do, saying things like, now this 3rd one is going to be a lot more challenging for you. So, put on your I'm going to do it hats. You can do this. You have to keep saying I can do this, because I want to see if you can do this task that's a little bit more challenging. Don't give up on yourself. Don't give up on the task. That would be just some prompts dealing with the social emotional part of it. So academic skills, academic behaviors, and social emotional skills to manage. All 3 have to be integrated into our lesson planning. You have a template, and I may have to get out of this to get the template here. Hold on. Just give me 1 second. Let me see, there should be another. All right, so because I had to switch computers and I moved everything into Dropbox, I apparently did not move, and I apologize for that, but that's okay. I've got it broken down. So you have something called lesson design template. And this template is multiple steps on guiding you through the lesson planning process. So we're going to take those step by step. This is what the template looks like. And this is a template that may not necessarily guide your lesson planning every time you do it, but it's an integrity tool to be sure that you're doing all the components. So just look at the bottom here, since I didn't load this. Down here where my cursor is circling, that looks like step 1 of the framework, right? General ed staff, tier 1 staff, identifies the instructional strategies and pacing to attain the instructional goals. That is UDL principle 1, and discussion of strategies and engage students That's integrating principle 1 and 3 into the lesson planning process. And if you download that, this will take you step by step, but we're going to go step by step. I also have given you a guide that takes each of these steps and provides you more scaffolding for those steps. And you can look at that. We're going to keep coming back to that over the course of our work together. So this is what page 1 of the template looks like. We've already been through this. So teacher, Tier 1 staff identifies the instructional strategies and pacing. The pacing is so incredibly important because if specialized folks are going to be doing pre-teaching, so if Anna wants to work on fluency and have that student actually using their social studies book or literacy book so that they get the connection between what Anna's doing and what's happening in Tier 1, then Anna needs to be working on fluency for words that are aligned with what the kids are going to be reading that week. So it's really important that we have that. So at that point, we're going to select what are our instructional strategies going to be to teach this particular lesson. Now, there's a whole variety of strategies, and some of them are more evidence-based than others. And some of them are very popular and have no impact on student learning. We're going to focus on that November 9th. But here's a suggested activity that I do all the time when I'm doing this directly with groups of teachers. It's fun. And I'm just going to summarize it here. I scaffolded it pretty heavily for you. So I asked everybody in the room, take a pencil and a piece of paper or a pen, I don't care, whatever, and put the paper down either if you're right-handed or left-handed, and take that pencil or pen and just hold it in your hand on the paper. And then ask each person to identify a lesson that they're going to be teaching tomorrow or this afternoon. Whatever it is, math, literacy, I don't care. Elementary, middle, second, I don't care. Just identify the next lesson to themselves that they're going to be teaching. Once they've identified that, raise your hands when you've got the lesson you're thinking about. Then third, the next thing, pick up your paper and pick up the pen or pencil and hold it over the blank sheet of paper. Now, close your eyes. Visualize yourself teaching that lesson and the kids in front of you. When you can see that happening, raise your hand that doesn't hold the pencil. Keep visualizing it. And as you're visualizing it, write down the first names of any student that is not engaged in your instruction. And when that's the two things. On average, 20% of the kids in a classroom's names appear on that sheet. And I also have teachers saying, you didn't have to tell me to close my eyes. I could have told you who these kids were. And then I'd say, now that you've identified the kid prior to the teaching lesson, and you've identified that a number of kids wouldn't be engaged with what you had decided to do, wouldn't this be a good time to revisit Principle 1 of UDL and knowing that those kids are not going to be engaged with how you've decided to present the lesson, think about other methods of presenting that will engage these students. Why wait until they're disengaged and now you're trying to teach and re-engage kids? We should know who's not going to be engaged with what lessons approaches we picked before that lesson occurs. And would this be a practice to strengthen your lesson plan? So in this first template page, we'll find a step where that is to be considered. Now, given there are time frame today and I don't want to be moving so slowly, the pacing of this is driving me crazy. These are some reflect and discuss questions that you can do as a team. So this one is, consider your current lesson planning process. Do you think that incorporating principle one would result in selection of multiple instructional strategies to engage diverse learners? Because we identified who those kids were who are not going to engage the way we had with our first approaches. So we revisited it. We got to do something for Maria, Sally, Tommy, Raul, because this ain't going to work. Now imagine if an Anna or a reading support person or an EL teacher was there at that planning meeting. The teachers could look to you folks and say, what do you suggest? And here's just a little George bumper sticker. Gen Ed teachers should never try to differentiate for students with disabilities in their classroom. Just go ask a special education teacher what they're supposed to do. That's so simple. So think about that. Let me get back to this here. So steps 2 and 3 on this template, these are just cut and pasted from the template. Student performance expectations. Now we're going to say, now that we know how we're going to teach it, how are we going to let students demonstrate their knowledge? And that's easy because typically the students that you identified as having difficulties with engaging the lesson are also going to be the ones you have to be flexible for in performing their skills. So if you have 25 kids in the class, you've got 20 who can write the answers or do whatever you normally traditionally do. But you've got to say, okay, these kids aren't going to be able to write a paragraph. So what are we going to do? And at that point, you then have identified the students for whom both instructional methods and performance expectations will result in a problem, and you are generating solutions to that ahead of time. There was something else I was going to mention to you here. This is a tease for November 9th. For example, strategy-based learning is a highly effective general education instructional approach that is evidence-based for kids with disabilities, for English learners with and without disabilities. So if you pick an instructional approach that has this flexibility, you picked it to begin with, then you might be in a situation saying, well, I'm going to use strategy-based instruction for 8th grade reading comprehension. And this approach really is validated for both typical learners and kids with disabilities who are reading fluently below grade level. So now you've got one approach that's going to work for diverse groups of kids. That would be the goal. That, by the way, is called universal instruction, but we'll talk more about that next time. I gave you the example of a rubric, and these are the things we looked at before. I do want to have you reflect and discuss right now. I'm going to combine these two reflections. To what degree does a lesson planning process in your school or district include principle 1 or 2? Particularly for those students for whom traditional options might not reflect the actual skill level for a student. What actions do you think you're going to have to take to begin to integrate principles 1 and 2 into your lesson planning process? Can we take 7 minutes for that, Kirsten?
Rooms are open.
And I'm gonna look at the chat box while you guys do that.
We're back.
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. Appreciate it. So once again, if you just put some of your comments from your discussion in the chat box as we move ahead, that would be helpful. There have been a couple of comments here about love the networking and those two types of things. Anna posted something as well as someone else posted use of videos. I work with many teachers who were involved some years ago in flipping classrooms, and they put their lessons, they live stream their lessons before the kids get there, so that the kids can watch the next day's lesson being presented ahead of time. Or if there's, Anna, I'm not sure exactly how you're using the videos, but having the videos for each part of the lesson, students can go back and look at it again and again and again. And parents could also see that and be a way to support. And just as an aside, don't forget the Institute for Education Sciences, IES. And I will get the link to this and send it to maybe Kirsten or Kelly, and they can post it. IES has put videos out aligned with the standards for literacy for kindergarten through grade 3 on hundreds of YouTube videos in English and Spanish for activities that parents can do with kids, even if the parent is not skilled at reading, can do with their kids at home to support reading instruction. All the teacher has to do is identify from the rubric which videos go along with which lessons in your pacing process. And you can send those home to parents and say, here's some stuff to do for next week for what the kids are going to be learning. So this use of video is another asynchronous but highly effective way to think about instructional supports. Okay. The next step is, which really is a continuation of step 3, is everybody discusses strategies to reduce or eliminate the barriers to student performance at risk. And these are primarily behavior and social emotional strategies. So now that we've decided what we're going to do, that skill,
how are we going to manage the students to manage their, to engage the task? And since multiple, for the kids we're talking about, they have multiple teachers. Teachers could share examples of, well, I found that this works with him or her or whatever. So this is really student engagement for those students who are hard to engage or hard to manage. And we're going to talk, we'll talk next time about each of these areas, but the one that I feel is most effective is behavior supports that we integrate into the delivery of instruction. And I'm going to give you a good reference for that. There are 7 of them, and you can do a book club in your school for one strategy a month. And it really is addressing Principle 3 of UDL. We're going to skip this one for now. Step 5. And I'm going to go through this quickly, and then I'm going to ask for you to have a discussion, because this is probably one of the hardest things logistically to do. So your specialized support folks articulate what you're doing and how it aligns to Tier 1. And you then want to take that Tier 1 strategy and say, here's how we're going to organize our. So I'm looking at at Anna's face here. So after you know clearly what's going on in the classroom with your 7th grade, you said you have 7 to 12. Okay. Then you go back and think, how can I actually, what I do in trying to close the gap, how can I do it in a way that integrates with what's going on in Tier 1? That's the hardest question to answer. So there's just a few steps here. So your specialized providers, you meet separately. This could be asynchronously or it could be together to lesson plan what you're going to be doing in the context of tier 1. You particularly special ed and some EL and all reading support. You guys, whether it's specially designed instruction or evidence-based reading strategies, you should have these at your fingertips more than tier 1 folks. So how can you use specialized instruction to move that kid faster than just with the instruction in tier 1? That's the question. And highly specialized should move kids faster. Does that make sense? So I know that, Anna, you talked before about teaching to the current instructional level. So given, let's say, what's going on in social studies in 7th or 8th or 9th grade, and knowing what's happening there, particularly things like homework. They have 2 pages of reading to do for homework. Your kids read 20 words correct per minute. I'm just making that up. Compared to kids who read 100 words. So we have a problem here that the student who has fluency issues, that's going to take that kid maybe 3, 4, 5 times longer to read the homework assignment compared to other kids. So now we have a persistence thing. Even if this kid was hell-bent on getting it all done, it's going to take 3 times. And gen ed teachers don't know when they're assigning 2 or 3 pages to read that kid with a fluency problem, that's going to take that kid 50 minutes, what will take other kids 15 minutes. So that's where that special ed teacher comes in and says, how can we mitigate some of this? What can I do? Maybe we can use that, those 3 pages that week for promoting comprehension or something, exposing the kid to the content. So that even that will improve the kid's engagement in tier 1, for sure. So alignment with the scope, sequence, and pacing chart for tier 1 is always a priority for the reasons that we've already talked about. So this is basically just some of the steps that we just went through. So you review the information, you identify current instructional strategies. How should those be modified? Or there's a difference between modifying and mitigating it. So modifying it, you might do text to speech. Mitigating it, you might pre-teach so that that kid is exposed to the 3 pages of social studies without the reading getting in the way. There's lots of ways to get, the goal here is how do we get kids access to the content? If you keep that goal focused, then a lot of the strategies and what have you will fall out. So group identifies specific strategies to ensure the adverse effects of skill deficits can be reduced. So what do we talk about here? Same thing. We might use text to speech. We might use strategy-based instruction. The goal here is to reduce student engagement and increase access to grade level content. So this is an important thing here as well. So let's say you're using Wilson's Foundations or you're using some of the stuff that appeared in the chat box. Those boxes have 2 components. They have strategies and they have content. Doesn't mean you can't use the boxes, but at some point you want to use those strategies and apply it to grade level materials in your specialized instruction. The strategies are more important than the content. The problem with using the boxes is kids learn to read about stuff, vocabulary, content that is not what is in tier 1. And although it may be interesting, it's not helpful. So how do we apply your expertise as a special ed teacher, EL teacher, reading support teacher in utilizing instructional strategies, but applying it to the kids' classroom materials. Just because Anna's face is the last one here, you probably want to move yourself. I'll quit picking on you. If you're working with kids reading in 7th grade social studies, you know, you should be sure you have that 7th grade social studies book, so that you can say, now we've been doing this, now let's try some of your stuff that you're doing in class. And that concrete use of that book automatically engages the kid. Now the kid goes, oh, so Miss Anna is helping me get ready for class tomorrow, or what have you. It's a huge engagement strategy. I'm going to move along quickly here. The calibration is done by the observing we talked about. Specialized teachers observing general ed teachers coming in. And like I said, when I was a building principal, it was a requirement. We set up time, we set up schedules throughout the year for that to happen. Everybody has to know what instruction looks like if you're part of a team working with the same group of kids. So we're about at 11:25, and I've just kind of blasted you through this last section. What I would like for you to do, we have about 5 or 6 more minutes, and then we're going to do, we need some time here at the end for Kirsten to do something. And I've got some implementation activities for you folks. We've talked about a lot of stuff today. We've talked about the research about why this is effective, having this integrated lesson planning. We've talked about the fact that the 3 principles of UDL do guide this lesson planning. The only difference is we want everybody to be using UDL. We talked about a 4-step framework. It's a framework, the 4 critical elements to collaborative lesson planning. I also said at the beginning that this could be done asynchronously. This can be done in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be done in the sequence of the support materials that I've given you. The goal is to ensure that even if a kid has 3 teachers, they think they have 1. Because everybody's doing basically the same thing, but with different approaches and different intensities. And the student sees how these different people are on the same page, if that makes sense. So I would like for you to just put in the chat box right now, take 3 or 4 minutes. What are your big takeaways from today? The answer, Kevin, about student time engaging, yes, it is, and I'll get some citations for you.
Dr. Bash, do you want me to go ahead and read some of these out loud?
Oh, I'm sorry?
Do you want me to read some of the things in the chat out loud? Would that be helpful?
No, I think people are reading it. I'm just reading it as I go to.
Okay, I'm also wondering about the recording. It might be helpful if we kind of noted some of the things that are there. Just
Yeah, and if we can save the chat and send it to everybody.
Oh yeah, we can totally do that.
Right. Other comments?
It looks to me like there's a lot. Everybody's got a lot of things.
Well, I mean, what it's important to me is knowing what engaged you so that I can use this moving forward.
Sure.
Yeah, the pre-teaching thing, folks, is the effect size of reteaching is very low. The effect size of pre-teaching is very high.
Would you mind sharing? I saw a question way earlier. Would you mind sharing that research at some point too, or where the effect size that
Yeah,
information?
we're going to do that in October, in November.
Okay, perfect.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. And I'm going to send you out now that we have everybody, we know who everybody is, and we have contact with you. I'm going to be sending you out stuff before our meeting next time. Yes. If you have instructional coaches, this last comment, that is a perfect blending of instructional coaching around something that will have a huge impact on student outcomes. So before I do the last slide here and summarize, I want to just summarize that. The goal for today was to laying all of this out, to giving you a helicopter view of this process with a focus on those big ideas. Just focus on the 4 steps of the framework. Focus on what steps UDL, what principles of UDL are integrated into. Think about how we could approximate this everybody lesson planning together. Everybody observing each other. Everybody communicating what they're doing. Those are the 3 collaboration activities. How do we bring that to lesson planning? Some of you are going to be in different places from the chat at the very beginning. Some of you are in places that are simply not doing it. Best intent kind of thing. You may be wanting to start at a different place. Some of you, there were some people here, I don't know who they were, but on the polls, we had anywhere between 5 and 10% of people strongly agreeing with those. So what about the things we talked about today would you think might strengthen your already existing lesson planning process? So you're going to be all over the place on this. So let me ask you a single question with a single answer. You can put yes or no. Overall, did this make sense to you today? Just put in Y or N. Okay, good. That helps me moving forward. So now is my gift to you. I have, if you will download this from some, of course, Michelle, absolutely. If it didn't create more questions, I would be really disappointed. Because those questions might be one of 2 things around how do we do this? How do we do it better? Or the questions might be things that are going to be helpful to all of us as a network. So these are, I think one of the problems we have with any kind of professional learning that really bugs me is how do we move from step 2 of, the learning forward evidence-based practice for professional learning of knowledge, skills, and dispositions. How do we move from that to practice? Well, we've all been doing a lot of Zooming stuff because of, we all get into this because of COVID, what have you. The worst thing that could happen is between now and November, you don't do anything. Just kind of back to normal. So, and I put some stuff here. I know I've been working in schools so long that I know that 98% of your time every day is already taken up with teaching, managing, and surviving the teaching and learning process. So you don't have a lot of time to all of a sudden start busting out and doing a bunch of stuff. So I have a long list of implementation activities for you to consider. Whether you're a building principal, whether you're a teacher leader, a teacher, it doesn't matter. All I'm asking you is to pick something and do it between now and November 9th. And we'll do a survey a week before, not that you have to identify yourself by name, but just something to keep today alive before we move to the next step. which is really going to be focused on instruction and integrity of doing this. Good. Thank you. And because you've been awesome, and we got all of our work done, then you get out early. Kirsten has to that was a advanced organizer for you. She has something she wants to post for the exit code. And any parting comments by anyone, any requests before next time, other than the what you've already put in there?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Batch, for just sharing such an informative and collaborative presentation today for us, and a session that was very interactive. And we really look forward to the next session, which is on November 9th. Also, too, remember that the presentation today is recorded and will be posted on the patent website. And in the chat, you'll find the exit code and then the link for the attendance verification. And I will see if I can share the last slide.
And I want to thank everybody for your participation in the chat. You took time to do that. Clearly, your conversations were thoughtful and focused, and I really appreciate it. So enjoy your week. And let's give Kirsten